Hi, everyone. We're back with kind of a basic intro into ecology, a little more advanced than our first one. So it'll go into some of the things with a little bit more detail. So the first thing you need to kind of just know is that diversity is really important, even for things that we really don't like. So in the upper left corner, that's a black widow. There's brown widows. There's obviously a whole bunch of different spiders, and as much as some of us may not like them, they are a part of the ecosystem. That bottom picture, the one with the egg, my friend actually took this picture. It was found outside of their house, and the reason I included this is because that little guy is actually the male. So when we think of a traditional black widow, a black widow, it's actually the female we're thinking about. The male looks quite a bit different. It's almost like slightly green stripes, so they don't have that traditional look. So beware the type of spider that you encounter, because not all of them look like what you think they will. So we're going to be looking at biomes a couple times throughout the semester, but as a kind of just basic definition, it's a large region of Earth, for example, a desert or a rainforest, that has a particular climate. So the most important thing about a biome is their weather patterns in terms of rain and the amount of sun they get. Those are kind of the biggest factors. So precipitation and sunlight. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of biomes that you can name, and we will be doing some projects based on those. But definitely, there are so many biomes that can be overwhelming because there's aquatic biomes and land biomes. Definitely at least know the basic ones like desert, rainforest, and we'll go over some of the other ones in detail that you should at least be like, okay, well, the desert doesn't get a lot of rain, that kind of stuff. And it's super hot. So like I said, temperature, I should specify temperature, not like amount of sunlight, but temperature and rain are the biggest factors. So, kind of basic food chain here, and this is what we would call a food chain rather than a food web. If you look at this is oversimplified. So, you've got your sun, which is giving its energy to the producers. These are going to be your plants and your algae and things like that. You can see at the question at the top another name for producers. Another name would be photoautotrophs. So, autotrophs meaning makes their own food from the sun, photo from the sun. And then everything else on there, all the other consumers, another name for those would be heterotrophs because they don't make their own energy or their own food. They have to get it from another source, another animal or organism of some sort. So up the chain, again, the simplistic chain, primary consumers, these are going to be your kind of vegetarians, if you will. They're going to eat the different plants, algae, etc. Secondary consumers will eat the primary consumers, and oftentimes we think about these like an omnivore kind of. Well, humans would kind of fit in the secondary consumer because they eat animals and they eat plants. But again, it's not a linear model in reality. Humans are often talked about at the top of the pyramid because of like we'll get into that later. But just know that like technically we're secondary consumers because we're omnivores. At least we eat two things, and then tertiary consumers typically just are going to eat, not always, but typically are going to eat just your animals. And again, not always. And then on the side there, these things are important. The detritivores and the decomposers, these are the things that are breaking down when those things die. So a decomposer literally decomposes. A detritivore can be a little bit different. They can sometimes be scavengers. So they're eating things that are already dead. And the decomposers, regardless of whether the thing is dead or not, they break it down. So those are really important because that without the decomposers, this is not a cycle. So we need the decomposers to break down those things that are dead in order to put those things back into the nutrient cycle, whether it be carbon, nitrogen, etc. And then detritus, non-living organic matter, once it is broken down and not living, then that goes back in. And the producers, plants, for example, will absorb those nutrients from the soil. So here is a little kind of basic example of a couple different styles that could be. So here is kind of a land one. So you've got your grass or something. Well, I guess you've got land on the right and then aquatics on the left. So you can see kind of what's going on here. Grass, for example, is the primary producer or the producer for the land, and then phytoplankton probably would be that. So phytoplanktons like a single-celled photobacteria where it can absorb its energy from the sun. And you can see, I won't go into detail with these, but you can kind of see what happens from there. So like you kind of move up the food chain and things get a little bit bigger, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a little more encompassing of the cycle of it, right? So a lot of times we see that linear example of the pyramid, but it's not really because of how like important decomposers are. So it's a little more circular in reality. What you should notice from this point or from this image is that everything is losing heat. At every stage, you lose heat. When the producers are absorbing energy from the sun, it doesn't turn all the energy they get from the sun into usable energy. When consumers eat those producers, when they eat those plants or whatever, not all of that energy is used, as can be used. A lot of it is wasted as heat. So that's kind of the thing that they all have in common. And even when you have at the top there the abiotic chemicals like carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, etc., even when those things are turned into producers, for example, when CO2 is used in photosynthesis to make producers, those things lose energy as well. So everything loses heat. Okay, so food chains first, we'll move into food webs as well, but this is like the simplistic version of how that energy transfers. What you need to remember is that energy always, it's the second law of thermodynamics. I don't usually see a lot of questions come up specifically about that, but just as a heads up, there is a decrease in the amount of energy available to each succeeding organism because of that law of thermodynamics there. So again, what we just said, we're always losing heat. Every level of the food chain is losing heat. And so therefore, there's going to be less energy left over for the next step up the food chain. In terms of everyday life that you see losing energy, if you think about even a light bulb in your room, if it feels hot, that's wasted energy. That's the purpose of that light bulb is not to heat. The purpose of that light bulb is to light. The heat energy is an example of wasted energy. There's a lot of examples that you can think of. So this is labeled a little bit differently. So same idea. The first trophic level is going to be your producers. Second trophic is your primary consumers, and on up. So this is just in a different way. And again, you can see the large amounts of heat loss. So the rule of thumb is that as you move up a trophic level to the next, so from producers to primary consumers, for example, you lose about 90% of the energy as heat. That's a pretty significant amount. So that's where this kind of image comes in. So the easy way to do this is really just to subtract a zero off the end, cross out a zero at the end. If we have, whatever units we're using here, if we have 10,000 usable energy whatever units as a producer's level, we take off that last zero, and now we have 1,000 for the primary consumers. Take off a zero, now it's 100 for the secondary on up. So a rule of thumb is that it loses 90% of its heat. And that is something that I have seen tested on. So just keep that in mind. That is something they want you to make sure you understand. So in reality, food chains are oversimplistic. We don't just eat broccoli or whatever. Like, we eat a lot of different vegetables and a lot of different animals and a lot of different nuts or whatever. And so really it's a food web. And that is going to be much more realistic in any kind of world that you see. So a couple things about food webs. So the first thing I want to point out is the pointing of the arrows is actually significant. So it's going from what is being consumed to the thing that is eating it. So for example, I see the sunflower or whatever it is, and it's getting eaten by a caterpillar, let's say. So the arrow points from the flower to the caterpillar. And that is actually important. If they asked you on an exam to draw the food web and you did the arrows the other way, you would get no points for that. The direction is important, okay? Now, food webs are obviously really complicated. So I have a couple questions there. What trophic level is the ladybug? Well, if we look at the ladybug over here, I'm not sure you can see my arrows. Let me see if I can circle. If you look at the ladybug over here, right there, so we've got the producers here, and then we've got primary consumers, and then secondary consumers. So ladybug's pretty straightforward. Producers, primary consumers, secondary consumer, boom, that's what she is. If you get a question like that, it's pretty easy to answer. Okay, so let's look at the black and brown beetle as well. So right over here, oops, if I can make a circle, there we go. Okay, we're gonna follow it backwards. That's gonna go here. So producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer. Sometimes they're not as easy as that, okay? And what I mean by that is, let's see if I can see a good example here. Maybe the mouse. So right here, I see the mouse. So if I follow the mouse right here, and let's say it eats this guy, if I'm following this pathway, and he eats this guy, and he eats this guy. So we've got producer, primary, secondary, tertiary. So in that pathway, it's tertiary. But what if I look at the mouse in a different way? It might even be a different complication. So the mouse also eats this caterpillar here, which eats the flower. So now we're talking producer, primary, secondary. So the mouse is both primary or secondary and tertiary. It really depends upon which path we're taking. Most of the time, if they ask you a question that's that detailed, it would be kind of like whichever one shows up most often. All right, so right here in a food web, the arrows point towards the energy. Like I said before, the energy flow, it's really important that you do arrows correctly this way. Okay, so whatever is being consumed points to the thing consuming it. And again, you can see that food webs tend to be a little bit more complicated, as would mimic a normal, like a real ecosystem as well. All right, so let's take another look at doing this activity here. So let's try to figure out where the krill is, if I can find it. Okay, so there's the krill. So one thing that I see is that the phytoplankton, it eats it directly. So right here, it's asking, so again, producer wants to make it a primary consumer. But it's also a secondary consumer. If you look over here, the herbivorous plankton eat the phytoplankton, and then the krill eat this. So it's also secondary. So you can see that these are not necessarily black and white. And again, usually if that happens, what you're going to do is just kind of look at the average. If it is secondary consumer 3 times and primary consumer once, then you would label it as a secondary consumer. Most of the time, you're not going to see questions like that when it's not black and white. So just as a heads up. All right, so an energy pyramid. Again, this is the same thing that we're talking about. Just move over the zero or erase a zero from the end of it. So let's pretend that producers could actually get 100% of their energy from the sun, or get 100% of energy from the sun. They even don't get a full amount, but let's just pretend whatever they get from the sun is our baseline, 100%. Then literally we're just taking a zero off. So herbivores, 10%. 1%, 0.1, just moving that decimal over. What that tells you is that there's not a lot of energy left at the top for those apex predators. And this is what people are talking about when they're talking about the benefits of eating lower on the food chain. If you're eating things like producers and herbivores and things like that, there's more energy, there's more calories really available. And so you can get all the nutrients that you need lower on the food chain, and it's better for kind of the balance, if you will. That is different than what you see here. So if you see a graph like this, there's lots of different things that can be labeled on the x-axis. So it could be energy content or biomass or the number of organisms, anything like that. There's lots of different things. So pay attention to labels. That's going to be really important throughout the exam, as well as just in class, just paying attention to labels or labeling things. And then the trophic levels. So again, our first trophic level, these are your producers, primary consumers, etc. So that at this model here, where you see the grass taking up the large chunk at the bottom, could be energy content, biomass, or number of organisms. Typically, you're going to see a lot more grass organisms, like if you think of each grass piece, than you would see grasshoppers, etc. Let me make sure I'm talking still with, yeah. So here's an example of exactly what we talked about there. In terms of biomass, there's a lot more phytoplankton than there are sharks. Just by like quantity, just by size, how much phytoplankton there is going to fit that model. So you can see it moving up the food chain and taking off that zero each time. However, the numbers don't always necessarily look like that. Okay. So for example, if I'm looking at an ecosystem or something like that, there's like one oak tree in this example. That one oak tree can host a significant amount of insects, which can then host a significant amount of woodpeckers. So the distribution is not always going to be that large bottom and then medium and then small. If we're talking something different, this one, we're just literally talking about numbers. You're going to have way more insects than you would oak trees, right? So if we're looking at numerics, then that's what we're talking about there. So kind of same idea here if we're looking at pyramid of numbers versus pyramid of biomass for the same species. So if you look at the kind of bottom two here, you've got the elder tree on the bottom, aphids, lacewings, and starlings, and you have those same things here for the pyramid numbers, but it's very different for biomass than it would be for pyramid number. Very few trees are needed to support all those aphids. So just a different model. So if you see something like this, don't be like, no, that's wrong. That's not how the energy passes up. You might want to take a look at your labels and see if it's actually talking about how many elder trees versus aphids, etc. So different cycles are going to be really important. We talked about this in our first lecture a little bit, but we if our cycles are not cycling, then we don't have a stable ecosystem, and it's not a sustainable ecosystem. So we need to make sure that all of these cycles are actively working. And at some point this semester, we will be covering all of these. The ones I would say to make sure you are most familiar with would be carbon and nitrogen. There always seems to be test questions on those, and we'll cover the other ones. I think for most part, water and oxygen, people just kind of know innately. And again, we'll cover them, but those ones, people tend to just kind of know a little bit. So just know that those are coming. All right, so productivity is really important. crucial, in other words. And so if you see that map there that shows gross primary productivity, so grams of carbon per square meter. So if you look at that, there's regions which have a lot more productivity in the areas so I can see the southeast here. Let me see if I can turn on my pen again. The southeast here has got a lot of that green. And then also West Coast, Best Coast has a lot of that green. Okay, those are going to be where you have a lot of your flora and fauna. It's logical, it makes sense. And then some of those places where you have a lot of, desert regions or whatever, they're going to have a lot less primary productivity, just partly based on what's naturally available and partly based on what we're doing to those environments that are making them a little bit less inhabitable in terms of native species. I always talk about gross versus net. So this class is, am I blurry? I might be a little bit blurry because I turned the fan on. I'm gonna have to turn that off. Yeah, I don't know if that helped, but oh well. I always kind of teach or talk to students about gross versus net. So how I always think of it alphabetically. So G comes before N. So gross primary production is literally how much you have before we talk about any of the waste. Okay, and net is then going to be after. So in terms of money, your gross paycheck is going to be bigger than your net paycheck because your gross is before they take out taxes. So gross is the OG, and then net is what's left over. Okay, so we're talking gross primary productivity here. Oops. So then now net primary productivity, this is exactly what I just talked about. You've got your gross minus what you either use, or again, with the tax example, you've got your gross salary minus your taxes and whatever else is taken out. And that's what's left over is your net primary productivity. So notice the equation says NPP equals GPP minus R. That R is typically respiration or whatever could be possibly using that energy up. So rate at which the producers use photosynthesis to store energy minus the rate at which they use some of the energy. Everything uses energy, whether it's a plant or an animal, doesn't matter. Everything uses energy. So that's that minus what is used is going to be what's left over. That's your net primary productivity. And that is it for today. So feel free to email me any questions that you have, and I hope this was helpful. Thank you.